Hello and welcome to Agency Office Hours. Karl Sakas here at Sakas and Company. Each month we're talking about agency growth, how to grow your agency more smoothly, and find ways to work less and earn more while rewarding your best team members. Here's a preview of what we'll be covering this segment, this session. First up, we have a fireside chat with special guest expert Jenny Plant. We'll be talking about predictable account growth, and she's joining us from the UK. Then I'll share a new way to see how your agency compares to others when it comes to client and agency collaboration, including how you can get some instant benchmarking results, all free of charge. Then Shira in Chicago has a question about pricing models, specifically about whether and how to switch from hourly pricing to flat fee. That's definitely a hot topic right now amidst the growth of generative AI, where hourly doesn't quite capture it, but there are some challenges in making the switch, so we'll dig in on that. And finally, Roger in Vancouver has a question about business development, specifically how can you move prospects down the funnel faster? We'll dig in on that. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer in a future session, please include it when you RSVP. We have options available for the coming year. Feel free to RSVP. If you have a question, include it. We'll let you know beforehand if you're on the list. As a reminder, we are recording today, so don't share anything out loud that you don't want to potentially become public later. And if you're joining live, go ahead and introduce yourself in chat. What's your agency and where are you joining us from? We'd love to meet you. All right. So, first up, we have special guest Jenny Plant. Jenny, let me go ahead and bring you on Spotlight. Jenny, welcome to Agency Office Hours.
Thank you so much for having me, Carl. It's an absolute honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, we've had various conversations before. Great to have you here as the guest today. Specifically, we're going to focus on how do you create predictable account growth. Before we dig in on that, if you could, if people aren't familiar with your work, if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. So I have a training company called Account Management Skills, and I'm dedicated to helping frontline account managers grow existing business. And I've been doing it full time since 2016. My background is agency mostly, over 20 years. I ended up as general manager of Publicis Life Brands. But I've also worked client side. So I was a marketing manager for an airline, and I've also worked for a pharmaceutical company. So I feel quite passionate about helping people who are managing the client relationship also have more of an entrepreneurial mindset and be a lot more commercial in how they approach their relationships with clients.
Makes sense. And some of my clients have done your training programs and have had a good experience. So, good news there. Uh,
Fantastic.
so as we dig in on predictable account growth, because I'm sure everyone here is interested in predictable account growth or more predictable account growth. eh, Let's set the stage. As a foundation for growth, what key factors help agencies prepare for predictable account growth?
I think the first thing to acknowledge is it really is a win-win-win.
Mm,
So, what I mean by that is if you imagine that you've got the agency owner's perspective on account growth, you've
yep.
got the client's perspective, and then you've got the person ultimately managing that relationship on a day-to-day basis.
Mm,
If you think about the agency owner, it's clear there's a huge commercial opportunity to grow the existing business. It's cheaper, it's easier, they've got established relationships, and they see that they have a bit of a leaky bucket syndrome. You know, the client comes in because they've won it,
yep.
but over time they're seeing all of this opportunity just going through the holes.
Mm,
So we could be offering more services, more solutions. We could be asking for referrals to other areas of the client's organization. With the existing clients, also for agency owners, they think about maybe going back to past clients and doing a bit of a win back campaign as well. So
yes.
there's lots of opportunity. So financially, there's a huge opportunity. From the client's perspective, they actually want agencies to be more proactive.
Hmm.
I read every report that ever comes out about how clients talk about their agencies,
Mm.
and there's always the same theme. And I often quote this quote that I think encapsulates what clients say about us.
Yeah.
The question was asked, it was one of the biggest studies, it was led by Tim Williams. They asked the clients, when you change agencies, what are some of the primary reasons why? And this one answer kind of rose to the top, which was because the agency never gave us anything that we didn't ask for.
Mm.
So, so they're telling us they want us to be more proactive, come with the new ideas, help them solve their problems. But we don't systematically and predictably do that. The other thing that was quite interesting, you probably saw the research, Carl, from a client's perspective, was I think it was Agency Edge in 2023. They ran a survey around client spend. Are they actually going to spend more
Mm.
money on additional ideas? And 59% of clients actually altered their budget in mid-fiscal year so that they could invest in either something that was going well, um, maybe they had a new product or a new service launch,
Right.
or the agency had proactively presented an idea that was very compelling. So from a client's perspective, they want to spend money on it. If you then look at the person managing the client relationship and
Mm.
how they think about account growth, that's where it gets complicated. Okay.
Right.
Now, according to Gartner at the end of 2019, um, it was all about why accounts aren't growing. And the report concluded that the account manager is actually key to this. Now, if you're from an agency that doesn't have account managers, it might be a different job title, but
Mm.
essentially it's that person responsible for the day-to-day interaction.
Yep.
And they concluded that if the account manager is either unable or unwilling to identify account growth opportunities, the whole growth engine falls. And having done this since 2016, I know every reason why it doesn't and can't happen.
Yep.
They're either too busy, they might have a kind of hybrid project manager or an account manager role or some other role. So that the priority is delivery and not growth. They might not have the support internally from their team members to help them come up with proposals when they identify an opportunity. They might not actually think it's their job. They
Mm.
might not be tasked with the forecast. They might not be sort of co creating the forecast target. So they don't feel any kind of, yeah, it's not incumbent on them to do it. They might simply not know where to start, or they don't want to be salesy or pushy. So I think foundationally, when we're talking about account growth, we've got to think in these terms
Mm.
because what I used to think was the solution to account growth, over time, I've realized it isn't,
Mm.
which is training your account managers is like the tip of the iceberg. But actually, underneath, what agency owners are looking for is a more predictable forecast.
Mm.
So they want to know that that revenue is coming in systematically. B, that they have more of a repeatable process that doesn't rely on one individual in the agency, but is more a process within the agency. So it's
Mm.
more sustainable. And then three, that they actually see account growth culturally as a competitive advantage. And I think all three things really provide the foundation, which takes us back to your original question, which is account growth is a way to future proof your business.
Makes
So,
sense.
sorry, that was a very, very long winded answer, wasn't it?
Well, you've actually started answering what I was going to ask next, which was about common challenges. What are the most common challenges agencies face? It sounds like one of them is the account managers just don't have time or don't have skills, or it's not part of the agency culture to focus on account growth. As you said, that can be a win-win-win. Any other common challenges that you see at agencies?
Yeah, I think one of the big things is understanding actually what it takes to grow and what it takes to retain. Because again, if we go back to Gartner's study in 2019, which I was celebrating because it finally gave me some data to point to for something that I was uncovering myself through my training, but you need to get that data and those numbers to kind of prove it.
Mm,
Because 88% of account managers believe that if they just go above and beyond on service, that's going to lead to growth. But actually, growth is making a new sale to an existing client. And it means that you are having what they call client improvement conversations.
mm,
And that breaks down to three things. One, you're painting a picture of the client's future business and how you are helping.
yep,
So it's very much about leveraging the understanding of what you do and what you specialize in and bringing them ideas for the future,
yep,
having a critical perspective on their business. So again, leveraging the understanding you have amongst your other experience and other client case studies and providing more of a critical perspective on what they're doing. And then three, delivering a return on investment. So all three things are actually what it means to grow an account. Whereas the 88% of account managers believed if I just go above and beyond on service,
mm,
and how that translated was into kind of if I just progress the projects, solve the problems,
mm,
um, and really go over and above, then I've got permission to sell. I've got permission to talk about other things. But the reality is that account managers tend to cycle through the first three steps
mm.
because there's this arbitrary ceiling on, exceeding expectations. So what I've uncovered and what I find so fascinating is there are so many just different nuances. Another big one is I'll give you an example. I was working with an agency that focuses on annual reporting.
Mhm,
Okay. So they did B2B annual reports, a really thriving business, about 90 staff. They had a big account management team. And within this business, they also help their clients with consulting on things like ESG, like
mhm.
sustainability.
Yep,
So they've got a consulting team.
yeah,
Now, the account managers that were going out talking to their clients were very easily identifying opportunities to cross sell their
right.
sustainability consulting.
Mm,
The problem was when they came back to the business to say, hey, let's put together a proposal for this client. We've done their annual report for a few years, but
right.
they also, because I've weaved it into the conversation, they want to talk to us. There was no one available internally to
Mm,
help them with that proposal. So
mm,
something I think it's worth thinking about is, and just to provide a few sort of tactics and solutions. One of the agencies I work with, in order to mitigate this, was to have a dedicated Slack channel, which is all about account growth opportunities, so that we know that this is a priority for us, but all the account managers knew that if they came back from a client conversation and they'd spotted an opportunity to sell something else to the client or to to help solve another problem that the client had that came up during conversation, that they captured that in the Slack channel, and that Slack channel was monitored by the senior leadership team, and it was their
mm.
job then to make sure that that was resourced, appropriately.
That makes sense. I mean, a lot of things for people to consider. You'd mentioned about people not having time. I have my concept, think of a Venn diagram around thinking in terms of desire, competence, and capacity. If things aren't getting done, you're missing one, two, or all three of those. People need the desire to grow accounts. People need the competence. They need to know how, and they need capacity. They need time. Sometimes I'll have agency owners say, "Well, my team isn't doing this or that." And I'm like, are they missing desire, competence, or capacity? Sometimes it's desire, that's less rare. Competence, they may not know how. But oftentimes they don't have time. It's a capacity issue. So, if things aren't happening, you need to dig into why rather than just being mad at your team, because that's not fair to anyone.
I think you're absolutely right. I agree with that, and it's a lovely way of thinking about it and covering all bases. I think often also there's actually, and this is something that maybe you wouldn't anticipate, is there's a some gaps in understanding about what actually do I talk about next to the
Mm.
client, i.e., what is the client's typical buying pattern from us, and why would the client buy into a next service, for example? So let's suppose you're an e-commerce business or a web design agency,
Mhm.
and 75% of your clients come to you because they want a website principally, but
Right.
you have a lot of other services that you offer as kind of add-ons. So maybe you do traffic driving strategies, through paid social, paid search, maybe SEO, maybe maintenance packages. First of all, you have to equip the account manager with the knowledge to understand what are the breadth of services you offer,
Right.
and why would the client actually want to buy them. So understanding, I think that internal training piece is quite a big one. And a lot of my, and something I do on the training is to develop what I call a service map, which is literally a one-page visual where you're really mapping out all of the all of the services that you offer, and preferably in the client's typical buying pattern, so that you're making it easy for the account manager to have that conversation.
And you've answered my next question, which is how agencies can shift to being more proactive rather than reactive. Though I think a key point in that is it's not just the AM being proactive, it's about the agency as a whole creating structure for that. Kind of like in the book Meltdown by Clearfield and Tilksick about how most failures are systems failures. Maybe an individual made a mistake, but it was part of a broader systems failure. People, your AMs need to be working in the right system to get their job done.
Well, I love that. And I've got my own model actually for this, which is three elements that have to be working in sync. The first one is to have commercial clarity. And what I mean by that is actually having a strategy for growth of
Mm,
the account that's agreed by this from the senior management's perspective and the account manager's perspective. So preferably a co-creation of the forecast target, and deciding if this which client is actually a growth client, because not all clients should be grown.
mm,
So which are the priority clients? How are we going to work differently with them? What actually are we currently doing with them, and how do we need to take it up a notch? For example, a lot of forums during which you have conversations with clients are actually status calls.
mm,
So, are there more what I call upstream forums like quarterly business reviews, innovation sessions, masterclasses, where you're having more of a conversation akin to the the client's business problem or business challenge rather than the project status. So, how are we going to work with those clients differently? And also, how are we mitigating relationship risks? So, that's the commercial clarity. The consultancy capability is the second thing, which is all about the skills: how
mm,
to listen, how to be curious, how to do your research, how to show up in more of an intentional way during those client conversations. It's the real commercial understanding, and asking the right questions in the right way, and presenting ideas in the right way. And I use a lot of behavioral science in my training as well. And then the third element is the system, as you say, the
mm,
systemization, the processes. How do you forecast? How do you go from an internal impact meeting where we are gathering the troops together to brainstorm ideas together as a team? And how do we take that idea and transform it into a client development plan that we are monitoring our progress, and also translate that into the numbers that go into the forecast? So that's kind of systemization. So there's a lot to each of those sections, but like you, Carl, I've been doing it for a long time, and
yep.
I think what I started thinking, I used to be invited in to do training for account managers, and a lot of agency owners thought if you just train my account managers, that's it, done. But it's not. There's no sustainability
Yeah,
if it's just that. It has to be those three elements.
that makes sense. So, thinking about juggling things, running an agency or working in an agency can often involve a lot of firefighting. I talk about ideally, especially if you're in a leadership role, shifting from firefighting to being the fire marshal. Rather than putting out the fires, your job is to identify why are fires happening, how do we prevent future fires, make life easier for everyone else, rather than diving in all the time to fight the fire. One of the challenges is that, yes, you're trying to grow accounts, but you also need to fulfill the work you're doing. And I talk about that, how project managers often are focused on delivering the work that's been sold, because you better do that, right? That needs to happen under warmth and competence. That's the competence piece. Warmth, though, of course, is looking for opportunities to make the client feel special and, yes, offer more work. What's your advice on balancing retaining existing clients by getting the work done while also growing accounts?
I think it's down to prioritization. I'm sure you'd say the same thing. And, quite a few account managers come to my training and I ask them about their categorization of their clients. Who are the growth clients? Many agencies have defined who they are, but I think the criteria might be based on what they've spent in the past rather than what they could be spending with you in the future. Because like we said before, not every client is a growth client. But with these growth clients, we want to be going the extra mile. We want to be being more proactive because that's the only way it's going to work.
Yeah,
So for some agencies, depending on your size and structure and how much everyone is playing multiple roles, I
right.
think even if you were to prioritize one particular client per quarter, to think, right, we're going to double down on this client.
Yeah.
Let's analyze where is the growth potential. And you could do that within an internal meeting. Where are we now? What has the client spent with us? What do we know about what their challenges and goals are? What do we know about the risk of keeping this client? So we
Right.
should be also looking out for things that could be red flags, like the client's pregnant, or and they're probably going to be disappearing on mat leave, for example, or um, we've been looking at the news or we've been following the CEO on LinkedIn and we know that they're going through a merger or an acquisition, that the business is changing. You have to make sure that we're pinning down the variables and also looking at which relationships we need to foster at the client. Because I think when we win a client, there's often multiple senior stakeholders involved. But
Yes.
over time, as we get more tactical, when they've done choosing who they're going to work with, the senior stakeholders tend to disappear into the background,
Mhm.
and the kind of more junior person is tasked with progressing the actual deliverable with the agency.
Right.
And, that's why the agency account manager, when they're asked to grow the account, often say, well, I'm dealing with this fairly junior person at the client side that actually doesn't have the remit to recognize value or budget, capability. So what we need to do also is to ensure that we are, and a lot of my agencies do this now, which is to have what I call an ambassador program. So
Mm.
when we win a piece of business, we make sure that those senior stakeholders are have a point of contact at our agency. So let's suppose it's a business unit director or a CEO, and they would have a relationship with our MD. Now, I'm not saying the MD is involved in the day to day running of the business. I know that you would find that horrifying. But if they are responsible for checking in with that senior individual on a quarterly basis, even, it just makes sure that we are spreading the relationship risk.
Yes, for sure. And agreed. They don't need to be the day-to-day contact, but the more that the agency can work upstream and then across different departments, the stronger the odds of keeping the client. Because then, at some point you can get into a client concentration problem where you're getting more than 20% of your business from a single client. That's risky. I mean, it's lucrative at the time, but it creates some risks. That said, the more upstream you are and also spread out within the client business, the odds of keeping things. I
But
shared an article. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, no, go on. Sorry.
I shared an article in chat about, thinking of red flags. If a client has a new CEO or CMO, we can predict what'll happen next. There's an old joke, which is, there's a new executive. They have three jobs to do: hire someone, fire someone, and rearrange the furniture. Sometimes you get hired, sometimes you get fired, sometimes the agency gets, well, rearranged. But the key thing is you can be ready for something like that happening rather than being totally surprised.
Well, let me give you an example to that point. I think it's a brilliant point, actually, because one of my agency clients had 40% of their overall revenue with one client, right? So
Uh,
we've probably all been there. We all know it's wrong, but it was this whale client. And I think what they weren't doing was staying close to purchasing and procurement because purchasing typically are closer to the C-suite. They can see what's going on
mhm.
at that C-suite level. And what happened is the CEO had changed. And you know what it's like if a CEO comes in, they often want to make their mark by saving money or making money. And
Yep.
what this CEO had decided to do was consolidate their supplier list.
Mhm.
So the first thing the agency found out was after 3 years of working with this client, they were presented with an RFP, a
Mhm.
request for pitch. So they had to re-pitch for that existing. So everything came to a screaming halt. Any business that they'd been lining up, in terms of a forecast, had to be paused. So I think, the lesson, what luckily they got it, they got in, but it was a hugely time consuming and the rates were renegotiated and the scope went down. So I think, how do you mitigate that? I think one of the things you can do is A, try to foster those more senior client stakeholder relationships.
Yes.
B, if they are an enterprise client, try to create a relationship with procurement. And I
Hmm.
actually did an interview on my podcast with the global procurement department of a pharma company, and it was all about how to nurture relationships. So that might be valuable for anyone listening because you could hear it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah.
Obviously, procurement vary agent company to company. Some are, I would
Sure.
say, more evolved marketing procurement people. Some are more on the kind of shark end where they're trying to, cut your fees and everything. But
Right.
when you do get a progressive marketing procurement department, they can be advocates because they'll open doors for you. And in fact, interesting, Carl, the fastest growing or one of the fastest growing job titles on LinkedIn in 2022, I think it was CPO, Procurement Officer. So
Yep.
they're becoming a lot more elevated within companies. So sorry, the concentration thing I think is a real important point.
For sure. And I wrote an article in 2019 about preparing for the next recession and beyond, of course, building your reserves and things like that. One of the things that I noted was that you probably want to make sure you have what I would think of as staple services rather than nice to have services. That is, what are the things that your agency is offering that are closer to revenue? For instance, if you're doing lead gen, you're getting leads in the door for a B2B client, or maybe it's promotions to make direct sales for a B2C client, or maybe something related to channels if they're working that way. That's probably going to resonate more for clients than something like branding, identity, things that clients would see as nice to have. Or, for instance, say you're doing web development, offering, refresh services rather than solely saying, unless it's a full redesign, we don't want to do it. That can be dangerous. So
Great
we
advice.
we could talk far more, but unfortunately, it is time to wrap up our conversation. I know we've shared links to your LinkedIn and to your website, but if people are listening, if people want to get in touch to learn more or to hire you or to get your free content, where should they go?
If you go to my website, accountmanagementskills.com, or Jenny Plant on LinkedIn. I'm very happy to talk to anyone about uh, client management, account management, client growth. Retention and growth is really my raison d'etre. So very happy if you want to go to either of those places.
Awesome. Jenny, thank you so much for joining today, and good luck to everyone out there as they're working through their account growth challenges.
Thank you so much, Carl.
Coming up shortly, we have a question from Shira in Chicago about agency pricing models, and then Roger in Vancouver about pipeline, how to make things go faster. But first, a share. I am doing a new survey in conjunction with DataBox. Last year, we took a look at what are top performing agencies doing to market themselves. That's available online now. This year, we're taking a look at a different question, which is the state of agency and client collaboration, or client and agency collaboration. What's working, what's not working, what's changing. The survey is currently open, so if you'd like to contribute, you can share your perspective in 15 minutes. But wait, there's more. You can also get instant access to benchmarking data, all anonymized and aggregated within the system to see how your agency compares. I'll also be doing a live preview of how things what we found so far and how things are going with the DataBox team, including their CEO, Pete Caputa. That's coming up if you're watching live this Friday. And you can register for that to join, or you can get the video afterwards. Taking a look at a preview of that information. One of the things that stood out, for instance, 42% of agencies say that client communication is their biggest bottleneck. So what can you do to fix that? We'll take a look at that. One of the other things, speaking about account management, we surveyed people around their current account management practices, and there were certain things that stood out, like, for instance, having one clear point of contact for at the agency. Most agencies did. Something that I thought was a much smaller item, across the overall response. One of the questions we asked was around what we have a documented training program that every account manager completes. Only about 20% of agencies mentioned that. I was surprised. Well, sort of surprised, sort of not surprised, but that's definitely an opportunity for agencies. So again, if you'd like instant access to early results, you can complete the survey now. And if you want to join us on Friday, December 13th, you can get the preview or watch the video of some of the initial highlights, and then we'll share the full results in 2025. If you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to Kate, our producer, and we can help. All right, next up, we have a question from Shira. Shira, let me go ahead and bring you on Spotlight. Here we go. Shira, welcome to Agency Office Hours.
Thanks for having me and answering my question.
Absolutely. So let me paraphrase your question, and then we can hear a bit more about it, and then we'll dig in on answering it. You asked about pricing models. Specifically, you are considering changing from hourly pricing to a fixed price model. The question is, should you do it? And if so, how? If you could elaborate on the question and we'll dig in.
Sure. So, just for some additional context, Capacity Interactive is a digital advertising and marketing firm, and we serve mostly a nonprofit constituency, nonprofit arts and cultural organizations. So, what are we lose a ton of time, and there's a lot of friction for clients in figuring out exactly what their scope of work is going to be and exactly how many hours it's going to take us, to complete that, matching all that up, getting them to decide in advance what they're going to do, which doesn't leave very much flexibility for them over the course of the year to add services, pivot if they need to. And just it's a lot of back and forth. And so our impulse was, what if we came up with although most of our clients are on a long-term contract, so most of them
Uh,
do spend money with us over the course of the whole year. So our thought was, for going into next year, what if we switched from calculating scope based on our hourly rate to a more open-ended retainer model where somebody paid us a monthly fee that maybe was tiered along with their budget size
Mm.
generally for organizations, that's program service revenue, basically tiered according to how much money they make from their earned income. It would be a really big shift for clients. And so the way that you sort of boiled it down into, yes, like switching from hourly to something that's more fixed, that would be a part of it. But it would also be a question as to, are there negatives to tiering in that way? Are there negatives to attaching your price, to something about the organization that's sort of static and then maybe letting scope kind of run wild? We see there could be some pitfalls in that. So that's just a little bit, we're just at the beginning of trying to like analyze things and see whether this is a road we want to go down, and we're starting to wonder what we don't know
Yeah,
about that.
yes. Well, let's dig in on that. So, to frame things, you're considering a pricing model switch from generally hourly to fixed price. It also sounds like, though, there are some broader questions around how best to deliver services, which get into a bit more of a business model question as well. So, let's start digging in on this. I will manage your expectations. I don't think we're going to figure out all of this in
Nope.
10 minutes, but let's see what we can do. So, agencies tend to price services in one of three ways: hourly or time and materials, milestone or fixed price, which could be a retainer or a project. It works either way. And then value-based or value pricing, which could be value-based, where you're anchoring the price around where things could be in terms of the outcome, or it could be a performance fee where you're getting effectively a royalty based on performance. So just to set the stage there. The other thing that your question raises is around custom versus productized services. And that itself is its own decision. Custom, if a client needs help and you have the expertise, you'll say yes, and you'll figure out how much it'll cost and go from there. If, on the other hand, it's more productized, a client comes in and you're like, well, these are the options. Or you may have just one option, which is paid discovery, that they start with as the entry point, and then you may help them beyond there, either on a custom or a productized basis. There are pros and cons to that model. If you primarily do custom work, that requires a far more experienced sales team. It also requires a lot of time from project managers and others around scoping. I remember working as a project manager on a sales support effort for a project that eventually grew to $500,000. And it was taking forever to scope because we were trying to figure out all of the nuances, all the details, kind of thing. And there were huge, huge variations. One particular feature, I asked our team, or the relevant subject matter expert, what their estimate was. And they said 40 hours. I said, okay. And how is that sort of a likely or a worst case or best case? Well, that's sort of likely. And I said, okay, what's the best case? 20 hours. What's the worst case? 80 hours. So now I have a range of 20 to 80 hours, and that doesn't even include the project management and account management and QA time. That's a big range. And, ultimately we went with the 80 number and it came in a little lower than that. But, you're having to make big decisions about that without even know if you're going to get paid. It's a tough situation. So something like paid discovery, and we've shared an article on that, can come in handy where you're getting paid to evaluate things, make initial recommendations, so you know what you're getting into rather than realizing, oh, that's not what I expected. So that's something to consider, regardless of whether the eventual work is hourly or milestone based. Paid discovery can be helpful. Do you currently do any sort of paid discovery now? And what does that look like?
We do for our services that are more technical, website analytics, that type of thing. For digital advertising services, we really don't. Or also even when we're creating content, we do sometimes do a paid discovery to understand what assets are available. But for main day-to-day digital advertising campaign management, we don't.
Makes sense. And, I will say something that comes to mind for ad management would be some sort of an audit of what they're doing now. So looking at across all the channels they're using, how are the various statistics averaging out? And given that you focus exclusively on performing arts organizations, you can share some benchmarking there. You could say that, I don't know, their average acquisition cost is $6, and you typically see that at 3. Or there's a 6 and you usually see it at 23 and and they're coming in ahead. So, it is worth considering that insights about what they're doing, including what's going well, does have value as a potential deliverable. Um, so, taking a look across things, you may also find if there's potential waste in their existing spend and things like that. So that's something to consider. We've shared some articles on, why the benefits of paid discovery and also how to get started. So that may be something to explore. But in the meantime, kind of more broadly, say once you figured it out, when it comes to advertising spend, the traditional model is for agencies to charge a percentage of ad spend that, in the old days was maybe 15%. Now it's more like 10 or even into single digits. And usually there's some minimum fee, right? You might say it's 10% or 500 a month, whichever, like you have a minimum. And maybe if someone's spending, $1 million a month, they're paying a much smaller fee. But the idea there is that, in theory, the more complex the situation, the more they pay. I'm intrigued by the idea of tying their overall fee to their program services revenue. There is a question that clients might raise. They're like, well, you know, these are ads that support 1/3 of our program service revenue. Can you charge us just 1/3 of that? And of course, you're thinking, well, I mean, maybe, but we're trying to grow that area. Like we're trying to make that 50% of the revenue. So how do you track that? Have you had any initial reaction from clients about tying to program service revenue?
You have not even asked the question. We're all just still starting to bat this idea around internally, and also to make certain that, we take a look at what clients are paying now, what they would be paying, and make sure that we're not, going down in our compensation. And
Right.
yeah,
I mean the part on things going down in compensation that ties into another piece, which is when agencies and clients are increasingly using generative AI, how do you capture the value that you're delivering?
yeah,
And if you're charging hourly, um, that's not capturing the value.
yeah,
For instance, if you've built out all of these systems, whether it's either a custom GPT or something more agentic, where you have, one agent doing this, another agent doing this, and then it's tying it all together, that's a lot of investment. For instance, I was at the first Bureau of Digital AI in Your Agency workshop, and one of the themes that came up was, getting things done more efficiently. In an example, someone mentioned going from something like 40 hours to do a particular thing down to just 4. But it also sounded like they had spent dozens and dozens of hours building the system and fine-tuning it and getting it just right. So if they were to charge hourly, they like load the data, hit the button, charge 4 hours.
right.
That didn't fully capture it. So for you and for everyone listening, I used to be more agnostic about hourly pricing, saying that if you're doing something new that you've never done before, ideally you get to fixed pricing, but it's okay to start on an hourly basis if you have no idea what you're getting into. But ideally, you're getting more and more experience and you're having a better idea of what to expect, so it's not totally new. And hourly becomes even less attractive if it doesn't capture. And yes, you could charge higher and higher hourly rates, but clients eventually push back. I had a client several years ago say that when I was quoting something that included a bucket of hours, his comment was, "That's more than the hourly rate. That's more than I pay my lawyer." And at the time, I didn't have a good comeback for that. I have figured out one since then, which is, yeah, that's more than I pay my lawyer. But unlike your lawyer, my job is to make you millions of dollars.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Nothing against lawyers, but you're paying for expertise.
right.
I would start testing this with clients to see maybe rather than getting into exact percentages, say, what if we were to charge based on your program service revenue? And for those who are not working with nonprofits, that's sort of on their tax return, that's sort of the most preferential type of revenue, right? That they're doing. That it's, we're getting revenue related to services we're providing to our stakeholders, as opposed to, um, you know, or I mean more on the expense side, but like you want to be tied to program services rather than, fundraising or administrative costs, which tend to nonprofits get punished for, I think not totally fairly, but yeah. So from what we've discussed so far, what
Yeah.
stands out as your next steps?
Well, I think that there's definitely some more digging we need to do on our own, but there's also definitely some testing of the waters just in theory, not with a number attached, like not like, oh, it's your cost would move from this to this, more like what would you think if, because we do certainly have close clients that are, would give us feedback, would give
Yes.
us honest feedback. Like what would you think of this generally, and how would that sit with you generally? And here are the benefits. If you had more unfettered access to us, if you knew what your rate was going to be all year without having to go back and forth, like if you could
Yes. In a sense, you're doing what they describe in the lean startup methodology as customer development. That is, you have some hypotheses that you want to test
Right,
about, do people want this? Is this something we want to deal with too? Kind of thing. So I just shared a link on that. And this appears further in the lean startup methodology. The nice thing too about having those conversations is it's not a sales conversation, right? So that the client or prospective client isn't like, oh, they're going to sell me something. It's like we're trying to understand how you approach this, how you think about this, what you need. I mean, eventually you might sell them something, but likely that's like 6 months from now,
right,
not immediate.
yeah,
Um, I would also include as you're reaching out to people to get that customer development feedback, I would also reach out to people where maybe they had been a prospective client, but they decided not to move forward because they're like, you know what, we're going to try to do it ourselves first, or
yeah,
we're going to hold off for a few months or what have you. They would be good people to talk to too, because they're thinking, maybe we're going to get some free advice. And you know what? Maybe you will give them some free advice, but you're also able to get some intel. I had a newsletter subscriber who was on my list for years, and at one point he seemed like he maybe needed help. We did a call. He didn't have a huge budget, but I had some options that could help. And his comment was, he said, "Carl, I could eat your brain all day long." No, he never actually hired me. That was, but people who love your content and who are highly engaged, even if they might not hire you, they are going to have some good intel. So just, ideally don't do too many sales calls if they're going to eat your brain all day long and never pay.
yeah.
Well, sure. Good luck as you're working through
Thank
things,
you.
and let me know how it all goes.
Will do. Appreciate
All right.
it. Thanks.
Thanks. Our final segment today is taking a look at business development, a perennial topic for agencies. And our question comes from Roger in Vancouver. Due to a family conflict, he's not able to make it live, but I'm going to answer his question in absentia, so that you can benefit from it and he'll hear it as well in the recording. So here's the question. When it comes to new business development, how do you speed things up? How do you get sales prospects to move down the funnel faster? Some of this will be unique to your agency and also unique to where customer or client buying cycles are. For instance, as interest rates continue to come down, that's likely going to make people feel more comfortable about spending money. But some people might want, a 1% cut instead of a 0.5% cut, and others want a 2% cut, and they're just going to keep waiting. So part of your job is to vet people to make sure that, they say they're ready to buy. What's the truth to it? One of the questions I ask in my agency profile is how soon people want to get started. And there are a few options. There's like right away, 1 to 3 months, and there's something a bit further out. Um, in your sales conversations, you can ask, you mentioned you want to get started in 2 months. Why 2 months? The answer may give you some useful insights. For instance, maybe they've got a trade show coming up and they need to be ready for that. That gives you an idea of their motivation, but you can also decide, are they allocating enough time and enough budget? For instance, it's a 2 months, but they want to exhibit at CES, the Consumer Electronics Show. That's not enough lead time. Whereas if they're making an appearance at a local event and they already have the basics of their booth, maybe that could work. But how do you get them to move down the funnel faster? Part of it is asking what their sense of urgency is, and then evaluating if that seems to be true. Or are they potentially, I don't know if I'd say if they're lying, but they may be deluding themselves at times. It also comes down to the type of clients you work with. For instance, if you're working with smaller businesses and you're working directly with the owner, odds are they can move relatively quickly. They may not always do it, but they can. They can if they want. On the other hand, if you're working with a larger organization, an enterprise client, that tends to be a lot longer and a lot slower. Jenny was talking earlier about procurement. When procurement is involved, it tends to add more timeline. On the other hand, you may be working on deals that instead of $50,000 in revenue for the year, it's $1 million in revenue for the year. So it can be worth it. Though Nick Petrosky of Promethean Research has done some research related to how long does it take to close things, and he found that mid-market clients seem like the sweet spot, where they're higher budget than smaller, micro or smaller clients, not as big as the hugest enterprise clients, but they tend to close faster, more like the smaller clients. So you need to decide what's right for you. In the example from Roger, he works with clients that are quite large. Amazon, American Express, the BBC. Mentioned that some companies don't prioritize spend in the category. He does podcast production. So sales cycles can take 6 to 9 months. How to make it go faster. If you're focused on enterprise clients, 6 to 9 months is not unusual when it comes to working with those big clients. If it's taking 6 to 9 months with small businesses, then yes, something is wrong. I would consider, are you building in a fast fail sales process? The idea is that if someone reaches out, you're trying to figure out as quickly as possible, are they a match? I've talked about this at the HubSpot Inbound conference about creating a fast fail sales process, and I shared an article on that, which we've shared in chat, and we'll have that in the website links as well. But don't spend time on people who can't afford your help. Whether you're using BANT, budget, authority, need, and timing, or my CRUX model, CRUX, the goal is to sort out, does it make sense to invest more time, or should you point them elsewhere? For instance, speaking of nonprofits from conversation with Shira earlier, one of the benefits of working with nonprofits as a client is that you can see their tax returns. It's public information, at least in the US, the Form 990. You can see how much revenue do they have, what are their expenses, what are their major subcontractors. You might see some of your competitors. Generally, they have to list if someone's getting paid 100,000 or more in services or otherwise. And you can see, do they have budget? You can also see maybe if they don't have budget. I worked at an agency that had a lot of nonprofit clients. That was our focus, nonprofits and mission-based organizations. And when someone reached out, we'd look up their 990 and see, okay, what do their finances look like? We found that as we were selling $100,000 websites, their executive director ideally made at least 100,000 a year themselves. If they did, that was a good sign. In contrast, I was at a conference and I met someone who's with a small nonprofit, and she was like, "Oh, you do websites. We need a website." So we exchanged cards. And once I got back to the office, I looked up the 990, and they had a great mission. They were doing important things. But as the executive director, she was only getting $20,000 a year herself as her salary. Based on their finances, they couldn't afford us. So rather than say, introduce us to our salesperson for a sales call, I said, based on where you are now, I'd recommend working with a freelancer. That'll be a better match for your budget. And I pointed her to an organization where she could potentially find freelancers that could fit the budget. So, yeah, you also want to make sure you're not fishing in the wrong spot. So I had a client a number of years ago who said that people in her industry weren't willing to spend money. And for sure, the people that she was encountering, that was often true. But I dug a bit further in our executive coaching work. I said, the people who can't spend money, are there people in your industry who can, and you're just not finding them? Or is it a case that no one has any money? That is it, are you fishing in the wrong spot? Or are you fishing in the wrong river or pond or stream in the first place? And we dug in a bit bigger, and one of the things we found was that something I suggested she explore, and it proved out as the hypothesis. Clients in her industry who had capital investment, that is, they had facilities, they had equipment, they had real estate, those were more likely to spend money on her agency services than companies that were a little more fly by night, rather than having the big infrastructure investment. So that made it a lot easier for her to target. Think about firms in your industry focus. What are some signs that they're a good match? In my work, agency headcount is often a good proxy. If someone reaches out and they've got a couple people, I might point them to some of my info products where it's, do it yourself at a relatively low price point. On the other hand, if someone has a really big team, they probably can afford more one-on-one help. So think about what the proxies are for you. And certainly the services you provide that are, we could think of it as closer to revenue. Clients are more likely to spend on those services and to spend faster. That was the example I mentioned earlier about if you're concerned about recession, providing staple services that are closer to revenue for clients, that your service leads directly to revenue, or, maybe a couple steps from revenue is going to be more compelling to clients than work that is 7 or 8 steps away from the revenue happening, or maybe it's not even clear at all if the revenue can happen. There are some exceptions. PR, for instance, can be fuzzy at times. On the other hand, I had a client who got their client in a Wall Street Journal cover story. Um, did that directly lead to revenue? Well, I mean, they would find out over time, but that certainly was helpful from a client perceived value. They could see that it happened. Of course, once you do that, then they want to be on the cover of the New York Times as well. Of course, depending on what you're doing, you may not want to be on the cover of the paper, but uh, such as it is. So, good luck as you're working through with your pipeline and getting things to move faster. If you're watching this live in December of 2024, across all the agencies that I work with and others that I talk to, 2024 has been somewhat better than 2023, which was really not a good year for most agencies. And there's a cautious optimism for 2025 about what's next, where things are going, and all. But of course, now to make it all happen. Thank you so much for joining Agency Office Hours for December of 2024. Or if you're watching the video, applying this wherever you are, running an agency is never going to be easy, but it doesn't have to be so hard. I'm Karl Sakas. Thanks for joining, and good luck out there.